It's a very odd experience to visit your old primary school, walking through those corridors that once seemed so imposing, looking at the classrooms and the desks and the coat hangers. It's all so small. In this video, I want to talk about how games are involved in that very same weird scaling effect of time, and about one series in particular that captures it perfectly. That is, The Legend of Zelda. A lot of discussion around games is about how they've aged. I want to focus on another question: how we have. The Legend of Zelda has had a long and complicated history with the idea of childishness. The most memorable experience of that is the first trailer of Wind Waker at Space World, an annual video game trade show hosted by Nintendo back in August of 2001. The response was mixed at best. Many were quite upset at the overly childish aesthetic of the game, with a version of the protagonist who'd later be called Toon Link, cel-shaded graphics, bright colors, and so on. In a way, the response was exemplary of the growing pains games were going through at a time where they were still called childish in wider popular culture. Why couldn't it be more serious, more adult? IGN ran an official Zelda bitch thread, which included complaints like, "Just when I was saying that Nintendo caters to old school gamers, they go and make Zelda look like a friggin' puppet show for 5-year-olds. Where is my mature Zelda? It ticks me off that they have to make it so kiddie." There was also an internet petition, which garnered over 11,000 signatures. "Dear Miyamoto-san, we, the fans of Zelda, plead you to realize that not all Zelda fans are kids, nor do we all enjoy your new animated/anime designs. Seeing as you have shown both a mature and a cartoon graphical Zelda, we ask that both be made and released worldwide." Looking back, the response seems a thing from a distant past, when people had different expectations about what games, and especially Zelda games, were supposed to be. One explanation is that these were young adults who had spent their early teen years with Zelda. They were, as sociologist Irving Goffman would call it, role distancing, a sort of performative detachment from childhood. These kids have grown up. According to a 2022 study by ESA, the Entertainment Software Association, the average age of a video game player is 33. And after a good 2 decades of very serious and adult games where dark and gritty were the keywords, it's not so much of a surprise that The Wind Waker is an enduring popular entry in this series, a breath of fresh air. What I want to explore is what growing up with a video game series looks like, from childhood to adulthood, both as an individual player and within wider gaming culture, which itself in many ways has been growing up with the medium. Part of the brilliance of the Zelda series is how it mindfully plays on this growth, and the reflection that comes with it. The story goes that in the late 1950s, a young Shigeru Miyamoto started exploring the bamboo forests and limestone caves outside his home in the countryside of Sonobe. The small village lies on the Sea of Japan, about 30 miles from Kyoto. On one of his trips, Miyamoto was about 7 or 8 years old, he found a hole in the ground. The next day he returned with a lantern and crawled in. Zelda's origin stories has become something of a legend in itself, retold by fans and journalists over the decades. Devotees of the game have made pilgrimages to some of the caves near Sonobe. A profile on Miyamoto in The New Yorker included some pictures of the reporter's trip to Sonobe. Among the images are a forest, a graveyard, and a small cordoned-off hole in the ground. Entering it, of course, would not be the point. The story is one about potentiality. The sense of awe and excitement Miyamoto felt reputedly inspired him to produce the 1986 classic The Legend of Zelda, which would lead to one of the most popular video game franchises in history. The game's famous top-down perspective resembles a diorama, or, as Miyamoto himself called it, a miniature garden that you can put into a drawer and revisit anytime you like. Like most gardens, it's under control. The player has an overview of the scene, as well as the size of the map, those 128 screens that make up the overworld. But that's not how it feels. On the very first screen, the one thing that stands out is a cave, represented by a basic black square, where the player will find their sword. No further guidance is needed. Walking into the cave is entirely optional, but very few players will have skipped it. And what made that first Zelda so memorable is how it encoded this potentiality. Just being able to move in any direction instead of just from left to right like in most side-scrollers I was playing was a revelation. This is also where many of the series' most well-known features come from, like hidden caves and breakable walls, some of which completely unpredictably so. There was a real sense of magic, because you never really felt you had a grip on what the rules were. It really felt like a surprise, a slight shock every 10 seconds as you walked off the edge of the screen and a new one popped into existence in front of you. Not unlike the experience I had around it as a kid, playing this game was unexpected. The lack of graphical fidelity also made it abstract, and you had to paint in a lot of the world's details with the brush of your childish imagination. And at the same time, it remained this miniature garden, spaced out on a tight grid, safe. The original art for the game included an image that stayed with the series, inspired by the romantic art of Caspar David Friedrich and others. It's an image that conjures up strong feelings of the sublime and the relation between man and nature. At the same time, I think Zelda does itself somewhat of a disservice by leaning on this image, powerful as it may be, because unlike lots of other adventure games, the game leans strongly on the childishness of exploration, instead of the sense of owning or conquering a landscape. Zelda is all about the Shinto ethos of living in harmony with nature, of being a part of it instead of mastering it. That confusion about why Zelda is so popular goes back all the way to 1987, when the cartridge version of the game came out in the US. The 1987 summer edition of Nintendo Fun Club News, a Nintendo fan club magazine that was later replaced by Nintendo Power in 1988, seemed a bit confused over how to present it. It focuses mostly on the game's story instead of the gameplay, and the sense of exploration it will become famous for. At the end, the announcement notes a bit meekly that Zelda combines the fast action you'd expect from an arcade hit, along with the depth and advanced role-playing of personal computer games. It's interesting to look back at how demurely and understated this classic series was once revealed, like the Nintendo marketeers didn't really know how to describe it themselves. Miyamoto himself, in a 1994 interview, was much clearer about the intentions. He wanted to create a game where the player could experience the feeling of exploration as he travels about the world, becoming familiar with the history of the land and the natural world he inhabits. One thing that Miyamoto and his team understood better than most other developers is that becoming familiar with the world you inhabit also means reflecting on yourself. As the years went on, Miyamoto's drawer became harder to shut. In 1998, N64 magazine wrote their glowing review of Ocarina of Time, the first game in the series that took to the third dimension. The boundaries had shifted, the camera was now positioned behind Link, and players could look over his shoulders and into the distance. The review took the tone of a tourist brochure. There's Hyrule Castle looming large in the distance, and Lon Lon Ranch off to your left, but from now on you can pretty much go wherever you want. On the next page of the magazine, we see a picture of Link standing in a meadow. Just look how far you can see into the distance. Looking back on the image 2 decades later, what we tend to see is not the view but its edges, those low-resolution textures of trees applied to flat-level geometry. The expansiveness, the distance, was still part of our imagination. You needed to use your imagination to view the edges of the map as places you could visit. It was these boundaries that produced the sense of mastery and control. It's a bit like visiting a clearly demarcated tourist site. There's a close relationship between the advancement of the medium of video games and the advancement of its underlying technological processes. Every installment in The Legend of Zelda is built on this advancement, from graphics to gameplay to sound. More than in cinema, this advancement means that most games very quickly become dated. But again, what sets Zelda apart is that it plays with that very problem. Ocarina of Time is on the one hand another clear iteration on this core idea about romantic adventure, heroism, good and evil, about courage, power and wisdom. But it's also about a different stage in life, that of the liminal space in between youth and adulthood. And looking back at it 2 decades later, there's something else it brings out. We can lose touch with the sense of excitement our youth originally evoked. When I was talking about the perennial discussion on how games have aged, Ocarina of Time might be the best example out there. The game stands as one of the most heralded and scrutinized games in history, and as with most well-known games, it's become a bit fashionable to say that it's overrated. One common argument people will use to make that claim has to do with the lack of activities to engage in while moving through the game. The actual map of Ocarina of Time's Hyrule has been calculated at about 0.4 square kilometers. There's an occasional tree or fence in Hyrule Field, but that's about it. Of course, such choices of spatial design were made in part due to the technical limitations of the Nintendo 64 hardware. But there's also a clear design strategy at work. There's an illusion of spaciousness that is maintained through the world's relative emptiness and its limited actionable objects and encounters. This is further enhanced by the high degree of asset recycling seen in trees, bushes, and walls, and the monotonous and repetitive tiles used in the landscapes. All of these things foreground a sense of magnitude and openness, and of being in between sites where the action happens and the story progresses. The game is full of these liminal spaces, on the threshold between zones where the adventure actually occurs. And curiously, playing it now, the game shines clearest to me there. Maybe because I still remember so clearly when I first saw it in the summer of 1998. I walked into the house of a friend of mine, a dark living room that smelled like the smoke of his parents' cigarettes. He was riding Epona, which looked spectacular in its own right, towards Kakariko village. He then walked through the town and up Death Mountain. The trek was both shorter and more uneventful than my memory wants to make it seem, but I still remember the feeling that empty, in-between space gave me. I understand that this is my nostalgia talking. For a while, I thought gaming culture as a whole was no longer as interested in these liminal spaces, as games were more clear, needed to be more clear about where you can go, about what there is to expect. These spaces in Ocarina of Time were overwhelming in their nothingness, but in retrospect can be considered boring for the very same reasons. Now, there's a remarkable connection between the size of these spaces and the game's adolescent player base. Ocarina of Time was a landmark title for a generation of kids, myself included, going through growing pains. This is also exactly what the story is about, a coming-of-age tale about an outsider stuck in between worlds who has to let go of their childhood safety after losing a father figure. It's about the innocence of peeking through windows, of crossing sunlit markets, and of young love, but it's also about the relentlessness of time and the threshold of adulthood. It's within that threshold experience that another of the game's retroactive issues comes to rise, how the movement through this world is tightly controlled. This problem is commonly filed under the term handholding, which Zelda has become somewhat infamous for throughout the years.
Listen!
It results in a tension between the player-initiated exploration of space, the series' original approach to mobility through intrinsic motivation, and its restriction by navigation, where the player is guided by the game. Any concerned cries of Link's companion in Ocarina of Time, Navi, her very name referring to her function of navigator, posed a fundamental boundary to the sense of possibility in the game. Her gameplay interrupting sequences clash with the narrative setup of the journey. Elf boy finally gets to discover the world, music swelling as he leaves his paternal home, etc. Another meaning of childishness appears here. Every child knows how annoying it can be to have some vigilant overseer on the lookout when you simply want to go explore. Breath of the Wild, to the surprise of many a Zelda fan, introduced an open-world approach to the series. The first impressions I got of it made it look more like a Ubisoft-style sandbox game, like Far Cry. You're climbing structures, uncovering a map, and so on. Upon release, the game turned out to be both innovative and a return to the series' roots of exploration and surprise. Andrew Webster wrote for The Verge that this new direction and shaking up of the age-old formula that has come to define the series helps Breath of the Wild return to what made Zelda so beloved in the first place. And yes, the iconography is that of romantic exploration, exactly like the original. But what I find fascinating is how Breath of the Wild performs this same idea of exploration so differently to the original. It's not the minor shock from walking across screens like in 1986, but about being immersed in a world, moving from experience to experience. It's not about filling in the details of that world with your childish imagination, but being immersed in a stylish environment filled with cues to previous iterations of the game. And it's about size. Breath of the Wild's impressiveness was partly due to its expansiveness. The game's map has been estimated to count around 61 square kilometers, the size of a modest town. The territory is saturated with wildly differing environments, coastal regions, jungles, deserts, mountains, pastures, and so on. It is diversity, not monotony, that produces a sense of size here. But what it has in common with Ocarina is that it still feels boldly empty. However, this time, these in-between spaces aren't so much liminal space in between the real stuff, it is the real stuff. The main advantage of climbing the game's Ubisoft-style towers is having an overview, seeing and marking the views that look interesting to explore. So you start engaging in this constant inspection of your environment. You're a part of it, but you're also above it. It's tempting to bring in some philosophy from Michel de Certeau, who wrote about map-making as a panoptic practice proceeding from a place whence the eye can transform foreign forces into objects that can be observed and measured, and thus control and include them within its scope of vision. Mapping transforms a space from something we are part of to something we can read. And Hyrule becomes a map saturated with actionable events to be read and captured. It's not a particularly childish form of exploration. Adding markers to interactive maps is a practice that most of us will recognize from our own technology-aided trips. It's part of the utilitarian logic of modern-day tourism. But this mapping is just one expression of the underlying ethos of this game. Let's call it Indexical exploration. Players are continuously surrounded by visual cues that capture their attention. A light in the distance flags the presence of one of the game's shrines, small challenges and fast travel points. Dense forests likely conceal some treasure or enemy. Players even learn to investigate minute out-of-place environmental traits, such as stray rocks. So it's not just about these moments of romantic overview, but about all these small encounters with the environment. The Koroks are a great example. There are no less than 900 of them, although the game crucially does not explicitly count them. The joy of finding out these creatures is partly due to the fact that their seeds can be redeemed for upgrades, but there's an intrinsic reason for doing so as well. Koroks are found through following environmental clues. The best way to find them is to simply pay attention to your surroundings. The puzzles you need to solve to find them are pretty easy. Following a trail of flowers, placing a rock in a suspiciously incomplete rock formation. But the difficulty lies with identifying when something is a puzzle to begin with. In other words, Players read the mapped landscape playfully, with detail-oriented curiosity, where every small object can be an index of something else. It is tracing these indexical relations that is the real treasure quest. But what's just as important is what happens when you actually reach these sites. Take the moment when you reach the temple in the game's tutorial area. The music is so subtle it's likely to just be absorbed subconsciously, but it's a fractured, broken down version of Ocarina's Song of Time, which plays at the Temple of Time. Later in the game you encounter a horse track and some buildings, Ocarina's Lon Lon Ranch. So are these the same places? Yes and no. Their size is similar, but there's something off about them, and they now stand in a much wider world. But in a way, this only makes them more powerful. It would not feel the same if I went to Lon Lon Ranch in the original. It's like the echo is stronger than the sound that produced it. Like seeing that primary school, the hallways and playground, and then walking onto the street and into the wider neighborhood, and realizing how this little world once meant so much, and how placing it into this broader context makes you realize its original value. This game's return to the series' roots is not just about less hand-holding and more exploration. It's about the inherent nostalgia of the places you are exploring. I found myself walking once more up Death Mountain, thinking back on that experience years ago. It was a much more arduous trip this time. The mountain had grown, like me, like my views and my problems. It felt as impressive as it did because it was an expansion on it. Like visiting a school that's as big as you remember it was, with huge tables and corridors. I find Breath of the Wild spaces interesting because it's both bigger and smaller than you'd expect. The game's story, some variety of saving the world and saving the princess, stands in sharp contrast with the kind of peeking, cooking, screwing around you end up doing. If anything, Breath of the Wild asks me, aren't these details just as interesting as the grand mission? I was steering Link around on the first horse he had found when a few stray piano notes started dancing in the background. It was a curious sound, as the game is so silent, favoring ambient effects. The sound of bugs and birds chirping, wind rustling in the grass, distant waterfalls. Naturally, I felt the music had to signify something contextual, some secret I missed. I dismounted and started exploring my surroundings, but I couldn't find a thing, and the music had stopped. This kept repeating as I played on, and it was not until I went for a long ride that the mystery resolved itself. Those few notes, appearing and disappearing, stabilized as I rode on. My state of distraction while playing, I was disembarking with every small encounter the game offers, had prevented the song from playing out. And this time the violin dropped in, and I found myself listening to an understated rendition of the game's classic theme song. The famous overworld song had become not just connected to a certain place on the map, but to a way of moving through it. Like in many things in Breath of the Wild, the moment was touching, but not grandiose. It was a musical detail, and it was there for only the duration of the ride. But it repeatedly caused me to keep riding, even as I noticed an arresting feature in the landscape, just to stay in this state of movement. It felt childish again, like humming a soundtrack to yourself while walking down the street. I recognize this is just my story. There are so many 9-year-old kids for whom this was their first Zelda game. They will grow with this series and the medium and once look back on Breath of the Wild and say, wow, it looks so small or so repetitive. Of course, that does lead to other questions like how far can this expansion go? I'd be curious to hear what you all think about the future of the spatial size of games. Of course, Zelda isn't about the future. It always looks back, and it allows us to look back. One of Miyamoto's most cited comments is this one. I think that inside every adult is the heart of a child. We just gradually convince ourselves that we have to act more like adults. But as generations of players are growing up with his series, it's also clear that it tells us something about a childhood that we all inevitably lose. That things that seemed large and overwhelming once actually turn out to be trifling. And that doesn't just show how games have aged, it shows that we are always still growing, that we can never step into the same river twice, that in the excitement and awe of childhood lies a key to why we enjoy video games. There are a lot of things that are upsetting about our current internet culture, but I'm very happy that the need to treat the term adult as a sign of approval is becoming less prevalent. C.S. Lewis once wrote that people who do this cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. Yes, games are childish. The best examples of the medium prove that to be right.